What if I told you that the American Revolution succeeded precisely because it refused to solve the social question? That its greatness lay not in liberating the oppressed, but in creating something entirely new, a space where people could act together as equals? This paradox has haunted me for decades, especially as I've watched revolution after revolution collapse into terror or tyranny. The French Revolution promised to end poverty and inequality, yet devoured its own children. The Russian Revolution vowed to create paradise on earth, yet birthed totalitarian nightmare. But America? America dared to do something different. It founded a republic without promising to remake human nature or solve the eternal problems of want and suffering. And in that restraint, that refusal to confuse liberation with foundation, lies a political wisdom we desperately need to recover. Today, as democratic institutions strain under the weight of social demands they were never designed to bear, understanding what made America's founding unique becomes not just intellectually fascinating, but politically urgent. Chapter 1: The Revolutionary Paradox. Why Liberation Isn't Foundation. Every revolution faces a fundamental choice that determines its fate. Will it focus on liberation from oppression, or will it attempt the far more difficult task of founding something new? Most revolutions, intoxicated by the energy of destruction, confuse these two entirely different activities. They tear down the old order with magnificent fury, then stand bewildered in the ruins, wondering why their noble intentions have produced chaos rather than freedom. I've spent years studying this pattern, from the French Revolution's descent into terror to the Russian Revolution's transformation into totalitarian control. The pattern is always the same. Revolutionaries begin with liberation, but end with tyranny because they never understood that destroying the old is not the same as creating the new. Liberation is essentially negative. It removes obstacles, breaks chains, tears down walls. But foundation is positive. It builds institutions, establishes relationships, creates spaces where people can act together. The American revolutionaries understood this distinction instinctively, though they might not have articulated it in these terms. When they declared independence, they weren't primarily focused on ending British oppression, though that was certainly necessary. Their eyes were fixed on something far more ambitious and difficult: creating a new form of government, a republic that could endure. They wanted to found something that had never existed before, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that people could govern themselves. This is why the American Revolution didn't devour its children like the French Revolution did. The Americans never promised to solve the social question, to end poverty, eliminate inequality, or create heaven on earth. They promised something much more modest but infinitely more precious: a constitution that would allow free people to act together in the public realm. They created institutions designed not to make people happy or prosperous, but to make them free to participate in political life. The French revolutionaries, by contrast, became obsessed with the plight of the poor, with what I call the social question. They couldn't bear the sight of suffering and inequality, so they promised to create a new social order where such problems would disappear. But the moment you make the revolution about solving social problems, you've already lost the political dimension. Politics becomes administration, and administration inevitably becomes tyranny, because someone must have the power to reorganize society according to the revolutionary plan. Chapter 2: Beyond Necessity: Politics versus the Social Question. The tragedy of most revolutions lies in their inability to distinguish between the political realm and the social realm. They confuse the public space where people act together as equals with the private sphere of economic need and biological necessity. This confusion has been catastrophic for political freedom throughout the modern age. When I lived through the dark years of statelessness, wandering from country to country without citizenship, I learned something profound about the difference between having rights and having needs met. You can feed a person, house them, even educate them. But if they have no place in the political world, no space where their voice matters, where they can appear before others as unique individuals, they remain essentially worldless. This is why totalitarian regimes can sometimes provide for people's material needs while completely destroying their political existence. The American founders grasped something that eluded later revolutionaries: that politics is not about managing society or solving social problems. Politics is about creating and maintaining a public space where people can act together, debate, disagree, and make collective decisions. The moment you burden politics with the task of eliminating poverty or achieving social justice, you transform it into something else entirely: administration, social engineering, or what we might call the management of human affairs. This doesn't mean the founders were indifferent to suffering or inequality, but they understood that conflating political freedom with social liberation leads inevitably to the loss of both. If government exists primarily to solve social problems, then experts and administrators become more important than citizens. Efficiency matters more than participation. Results matter more than process. And before you know it, you've created a system where people are governed rather than governing themselves. The French Revolution fell into this trap immediately. The sight of poverty and inequality in pre-revolutionary France was indeed appalling, and the revolutionaries' humanitarian impulses were noble. But the moment they made the revolution about ending these social evils, they opened the door to terror. Because if the goal is to eliminate suffering and create social perfection, then anyone who stands in the way, the counter-revolutionary, the skeptic, even the merely reluctant, becomes an enemy of humanity itself. Violence becomes not just permissible, but morally required. The Americans avoided this trap by keeping their ambitions focused on the political realm. They wanted to create institutions that would allow them to govern themselves, to participate in public life as free and equal citizens. They weren't trying to remake human nature or solve the eternal problems of scarcity and inequality. They were trying to found a republic that could endure through time, weathering the storms of faction and passion that had destroyed every previous attempt at self-government. Chapter 3: The Art of Foundation, Creating Lasting Institutions. What does it mean to found something? This question occupied my thoughts for years as I tried to understand why some political experiments endure while others collapse. Foundation is perhaps the most mysterious and least understood of all political activities. It requires a kind of political genius that appears rarely in human history: the ability to create something new that will outlast its creators. The Romans understood foundation better than anyone before or since. They knew that founding a political community was like performing a miracle, bringing something into existence that had never existed before. The word authority itself comes from the Latin augura, meaning to augment or add to the foundation. Roman authority always pointed backward to the founding moment, drawing its legitimacy from that original act of creation. The American founders recaptured this Roman understanding of foundation, though they modified it for modern conditions. Like the Romans, they knew they were performing an unprecedented act, creating a republic on a scale never before attempted. But unlike the Romans, they couldn't rely on divine sanction or mythical origins. They had to found their new republic on nothing more than their own mutual promises and their belief in the possibility of self-government. This is why the Constitutional Convention was such an extraordinary moment in political history. Here were men who understood that they were literally creating something from nothing, establishing a new form of government through the sheer power of deliberation and mutual consent. They weren't implementing a theory or following a blueprint. They were thinking their way into existence as a political community. Think about this for a moment. These men had no example to follow, no guarantee of success, no divine mandate. They had only their own experience of self-government and their commitment to the revolutionary idea that people could govern themselves. Yet they managed to create institutions that have endured for more than 2 centuries, surviving civil war, depression, world wars, and countless political crises. How did they do it? They understood something that later revolutionaries forgot: that the essence of foundation lies not in implementing an ideology, but in creating relationships. The Constitution isn't primarily a set of abstract principles. It's a framework for ongoing political relationships. It creates spaces where people can come together to deliberate, spaces where power can be shared rather than concentrated, spaces where disagreement can be productive rather than destructive. The founders also understood that foundation requires restraint. They resisted the temptation to solve all problems or answer all questions. Instead, they created a framework that could accommodate disagreement and change. They built flexibility into the system through amendments and interpretation. But they also built stability through separation of powers and federalism. Most importantly, they understood that foundation is an ongoing activity, not a one-time event. Each generation must refound the republic through their own political engagement. The Constitution provides the framework, but it cannot govern itself. It requires active citizens who understand their role not as subjects or consumers, but as participants in the ongoing project of self-government. This is what I mean when I say that politics is about creating and maintaining a common world. The founders created institutions that would allow future generations to continue the work of foundation, to add their own contributions to the American experiment in self-government. Chapter 4: The Constitution as Covenant, Binding Ourselves to Freedom. The American Constitution represents something unprecedented in political history. A covenant that binds people not to a ruler or a law, but to each other and to the ongoing project of self-government. This is radically different from other forms of political organization, and understanding this difference is crucial to grasping what made the American founding unique. Most political arrangements throughout history have been based on the relationship between ruler and ruled. Even when revolution occurs, it typically replaces one set of rulers with another. The revolutionaries may be more virtuous or represent different interests, but the basic structure remains the same. Some people govern while others are governed. The Constitution breaks with this pattern entirely. It creates a system where, in principle, there are no permanent rulers and no permanent subjects. Power is distributed, shared, and constantly shifting among different institutions and different levels of government. More importantly, ultimate authority rests not with any particular institution, but with we the people. Not as a mob or mass, but as organized citizens capable of deliberation and collective action. This constitutional arrangement embodies what I consider the deepest insight of political theory: that power belongs to people only when they act together. Isolated individuals, no matter how numerous, have no political power. Power emerges only when people come together in public to deliberate, debate, and decide on common concerns. The Constitution creates the framework that makes such collective action possible. But here's the crucial point. The Constitution doesn't just organize government, it organizes citizens. It creates roles, relationships, and responsibilities that transform mere inhabitants of a territory into members of a political community. When you become an American citizen, you don't just acquire rights and benefits. You enter into a covenant with your fellow citizens to maintain and develop the institutions of self-government. This covenantal aspect of the Constitution explains why it has proven so durable. Unlike revolutionary ideologies that promise to remake the world, the Constitution promises something much more modest but more achievable: a framework for ongoing political life. It doesn't solve problems. It creates procedures for addressing problems as they arise. It doesn't guarantee outcomes. It guarantees processes. The genius of this approach becomes apparent when you compare it to other revolutionary experiments. The French Revolution promised equality, fraternity, and liberty, but had no institutional framework for realizing these ideals in practice. When reality failed to match the promise, the revolutionaries turned to terror, trying to force the world to conform to their vision. The Russian Revolution made even grander promises about creating a classless society, but it too lacked institutional mechanisms for translating ideals into practice, leading inevitably to totalitarian control. The American founders avoided these traps by focusing on process rather than outcomes. They created institutions that could accommodate disagreement, change, and even failure without collapsing. They built redundancy into the system, multiple power centers, competing interests, overlapping jurisdictions, that prevents any single vision or faction from dominating completely. Most importantly, they understood that freedom is not a gift that can be granted by wise rulers. It's an activity that must be continuously practiced by engaged citizens. The Constitution doesn't make people free. It creates opportunities for people to act freely together. Freedom exists only in the spaces between people, in the relationships that emerge when individuals come together as equals to address common concerns. Chapter 5: The Miracle of Mutual Promise: How Beginnings Create Power. Have you ever wondered where political power actually comes from? This question haunted me during my years of statelessness, when I experienced firsthand what it means to exist outside any political community. Power, I came to understand, is not something that can be possessed like property or wielded like a tool. Power exists only when people act together, and it disappears the moment they disperse. The American founding illustrates this principle perfectly. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 had no power in any conventional sense. They weren't kings or generals or wealthy oligarchs commanding vast resources. They were simply individuals who had come together to deliberate about their common future. Yet from their capacity to speak and act together, they generated something extraordinary: the power to constitute a new form of government. This is what I call the miracle of beginning. Every act of foundation depends on the mysterious human capacity to start something new, to bring into existence something that has never existed before. The founders didn't derive their authority from God or nature or history. They created authority through their mutual promises and their commitment to act together. Think about the profound risk involved in this undertaking. These men were essentially betting their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor on nothing more than their belief in each other's commitment to the common enterprise. They had no guarantee that their experiment would succeed, no assurance that future generations would honor their mutual promises. They were acting in faith, not religious faith, but political faith in the human capacity for self-government. This act of mutual promising is the foundation of all genuine political communities. When people come together and pledge to act together for common purposes, they create something that transcends their individual capabilities. They generate power, not power over others, but power to accomplish things that no individual could accomplish alone. But here's the crucial point. This power exists only as long as people continue to act together. The moment the community disperses, the moment people retreat into private concerns, the power disappears. This is why political life requires constant renewal, why each generation must recommit itself to the founding promises. The American Constitution embodies this understanding in its very structure. It's not a blueprint for government in the technical sense. It's a framework for ongoing mutual promising. Every time citizens vote, serve on juries, run for office, or even just engage in serious political discussion, they're renewing the founding covenant, adding their own commitment to the ongoing American experiment. This is fundamentally different from other forms of political organization. In monarchies, power flows from the top down. In totalitarian systems, power is concentrated and used to control. But in a republic based on mutual promising, power flows from the relationships between citizens. It's horizontal rather than vertical, shared rather than concentrated. This understanding also explains why the American founding was revolutionary in the truest sense. Revolution, properly understood, is not just about overthrowing the old order. It's about the human capacity to begin again, to create something genuinely new. The Americans didn't just reject British rule. They created a new form of political existence based on the radical proposition that people could govern themselves through mutual commitment and shared deliberation. The tragedy of modern politics is that we've largely forgotten this founding insight. We think of politics as the struggle for control over government, as the means by which some people impose their will on others. But genuine politics is exactly the opposite. It's the space where people come together as equals to create and maintain their common world. Chapter 6, Judgment and Taste, the Political Art of Discrimination. One of the most puzzling aspects of the American founding is how the founders managed to make good political judgments without the guidance of absolute principles or predetermined rules. They faced unprecedented situations, created new institutions, and made countless decisions that would shape the future of their republic. Yet they couldn't simply apply existing theories or follow established precedents. They had to judge each situation on its own merits, relying on what I call political taste. Political judgment is fundamentally different from other forms of thinking. When we engage in logical reasoning or scientific analysis, we apply universal rules to particular cases. But in politics, we're always dealing with unique situations that have never existed before and will never exist again in exactly the same form. We must judge without the security of predetermined criteria, relying instead on our capacity to discriminate between better and worse, appropriate and inappropriate, wise and foolish. The founders demonstrated this capacity for political judgment in countless ways. Consider their decision to create a bicameral legislature with different terms and different constituencies for the House and Senate. This wasn't derived from any political theory. It was a practical judgment about how to balance representation with deliberation, democracy with stability, or consider their invention of federalism, which divided power between national and state governments in ways that had never been attempted before. These judgments required what I call political taste, the ability to sense what will work in practice, what will endure over time, what will maintain the delicate balance between freedom and order that republics require. This kind of taste cannot be taught through abstract principles. It develops only through engagement in political life itself, through the experience of acting with others in the public realm. The founders cultivated this political taste through their extensive experience in colonial self-government. They had spent decades serving in assemblies, participating in town meetings, organizing resistance to British policies. This practical experience gave them an intuitive understanding of how political institutions actually function, how power can be shared and limited, how disagreement can be productive rather than destructive. But political taste involves more than just practical experience. It also requires what Kant called enlarged mentality, the ability to think from the standpoint of others, to consider how our actions and judgments will appear to our fellow citizens. The founders demonstrated this enlarged mentality in their willingness to compromise, to accommodate different interests and perspectives within a single constitutional framework. This capacity for judgment becomes especially important when we consider the role of the spectator in political life. Not everyone can be directly involved in governing at all times, but everyone can and must be a judging spectator, evaluating the actions of their representatives, holding them accountable for their decisions. Democracy depends on citizens who can discriminate between good and bad leadership, between wise and foolish policies. The decline of political judgment in our time represents one of the greatest threats to democratic institutions. When citizens lose the capacity to discriminate, when they can no longer tell the difference between truth and falsehood, competence and incompetence, They become vulnerable to demagogues who promise simple solutions to complex problems. This is why the American founding remains so relevant today. The founders showed us that political life requires citizens capable of judgment, people who can think for themselves while also thinking in common with others. They demonstrated that democracy is not just about counting votes or implementing the will of the majority. It's about creating spaces where people can deliberate together, where judgment can be refined through discussion and debate. The Constitution itself embodies this commitment to political judgment. It creates institutions that encourage deliberation rather than hasty action, that force representatives to justify their decisions to their colleagues and constituents. It assumes that good government depends not on following predetermined rules, but on the ongoing exercise of political wisdom. Chapter 7: Natality and New Beginnings, the Eternal Promise of Politics. At the heart of my understanding of politics lies a simple but profound insight. Human beings are creatures of beginning. Unlike other animals, we are not bound by instinct or trapped in natural cycles. We possess the miraculous capacity to start something new, to break with the past and initiate unprecedented action. This capacity, what I call natality, is the source of all political hope and the foundation of human freedom. The American founding represents one of the most remarkable demonstrations of this human capacity for new beginnings. The founders didn't simply replace one government with another. They created an entirely new form of political organization based on principles that had never been fully implemented before. They proved that human beings can indeed begin again, can create institutions that transcend the limitations of their historical circumstances. But the miracle of the American founding lies not just in that original moment of creation. It lies in the ongoing capacity for renewal that the founders built into their system. They understood that each new generation would need to make the Constitution their own, to interpret its principles in light of new challenges and circumstances. They created a framework that could accommodate change without losing its essential character. This is why I've always been fascinated by the American tradition of constitutional interpretation. Unlike other political systems that claim to be based on eternal truths or unchanging laws, the American system acknowledges that political life requires constant adaptation and renewal. Each Supreme Court decision, each constitutional amendment, each significant political movement represents an attempt to begin again, to realize the founding principles in new ways. The Civil War and Reconstruction, for instance, represented a kind of refounding of the American Republic. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments didn't just abolish slavery. They fundamentally redefined American citizenship, extending the promise of political equality to people who had been excluded from the original founding. This was natality in action, the capacity to begin again even after the most devastating failure. The same principle applies to other great moments of American renewal. The Progressive Era's response to industrialization, the New Deal's response to economic collapse, the Civil Rights Movement's challenge to racial segregation. In each case, Americans demonstrated their capacity to begin again, to create new possibilities for political life without abandoning the constitutional framework that makes such renewal possible. But natality is not just about grand historical moments. It's about the everyday capacity of ordinary citizens to initiate political action. Every time someone organizes a community meeting, runs for local office, or simply engages in serious political conversation with their neighbors, they're exercising this fundamental human capacity to begin something new. This is why political education is so crucial for maintaining Republican government. Citizens must understand that they are not just passive recipients of government services or mere voters who choose between predetermined options. They are potential initiators of political action, people capable of starting new conversations, forming new associations, addressing new problems in new ways. The tragedy of our time is that so many people have lost touch with this capacity for political beginning. They feel powerless in the face of vast impersonal forces, global markets, technological change, bureaucratic complexity. They retreat into private life or become passive consumers of political entertainment. They forget that politics, at its best, is about people coming together to create and maintain their common world. But the American founding reminds us that this capacity for new beginning is indestructible. It may be obscured or neglected, but it cannot be eliminated as long as human beings exist. Every birth brings into the world someone who might initiate unprecedented action, someone who might begin something that has never existed before. This is the ultimate promise of politics. Not that it will solve all problems or eliminate all suffering, but that it preserves the space where human beings can act together to create new possibilities for their common life. The founders gave us institutions that protect and nurture this capacity for beginning, but they cannot guarantee its exercise. That depends on each generation's willingness to engage in the ongoing work of founding and refounding their political community. Conclusion: the American Revolution succeeded because it understood something that most revolutionaries forget: that the goal of politics is not to solve the human condition, but to create and maintain spaces where human beings can act together as free and equal citizens. The founders didn't promise to eliminate poverty, end inequality, or create heaven on earth. They promised something more modest but infinitely more precious: a constitutional framework that would allow people to govern themselves through mutual deliberation and shared commitment. This restraint, this refusal to burden politics with impossible demands, is what made American institutions both durable and genuinely revolutionary. By focusing on process rather than outcomes, on relationships rather than results, the founders created a republic that could survive and adapt through more than 2 centuries of unprecedented change. Today, as democratic institutions face new challenges and citizenries grow increasingly alienated from political life, we would do well to remember the wisdom of the American founding. Politics cannot solve all problems, but it can preserve the space where people come together to address their common concerns. It cannot guarantee happiness or prosperity, but it can protect the human capacity for new beginnings that makes all genuine progress possible. The American experiment continues, requiring each generation to choose whether they will maintain and develop the institutions of self-government or allow them to decay through neglect. That choice between political engagement and withdrawal, between active citizenship and passive consumption, remains as urgent today as it was in 1787.